As I was saying, we will leave some time for the OSPO news. Then we will move to the topic of the day, where Amanda will share with us really interesting remarks. And then we will leave some space for group discussions. There has been during this month new OSPO discussions that are in the OSPO forum, most of them related with security and vulnerability issues. Another discussions related with tooling for detecting open source code snippets, and another one related with metrics. So if you go to each of those links, you can keep track of those conversations and add your comments and thoughts. On the other hand, we have new to-do members on board during this month. There is more news that people can keep track by joining the OSPO news. In fact, the last issue was released last week, and in there, people can know more about OSPO jobs or new articles happening in the open source ecosystem related with OSPOs and open source management, news from the tutor group, upcoming call for papers for open source conferences or upcoming tech conferences that are going to happen during the next month. This is a live newsletter, so the community can actually go there, add their topics, their articles and their content, and we can build a better newsletter together. So I really recommend you to keep track on this newsletter, because we will also be releasing upcoming meetings for these OSPOlogy sessions. Also, I really want to highlight that the tutor group and everything around this project, it's open and we are welcoming new contributors. We are trying to improve the guidelines and the procedures on how to open new issues, like creating new tutor guides, creating OSPO use cases. So try to welcome more the community to actually start getting involved in the project. For instance, if you want a really first step for newcomers that are willing to start contributing to tutor, can contribute to upcoming OSPOlogy sessions. And as Amanda, you can submit an issue and present a topic that it's interesting for the community. Maybe share your OSPO journey or present research studies, share some tooling that can be beneficial for open source management or for OSPO daily activities. And you have all the info in the link I shared with you. Also, we have created new contributing guidelines to make easier for new people to actually start proposing new tutor guides, proposing OSPO case studies, work on white papers, and submit OSPOlogy call for papers. So saying this, we're gonna move now to the topic of the month with Amanda Casares, that is measuring the business impact of open source and OSPOs. Amanda, I'm gonna lead it to you. You can share now your slides, and yeah, I'm gonna just stop sharing. Hold on for a sec. All yours.
Thank you, Anna, for the wonderful introduction. Can everybody see slides? I'll take a look in chat as long as I get thumbs up or things. Great. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks for having me here today. I was very excited to see the call for proposals. I think it was like in December, and excited to talk with you all about measuring business impact of open source and OSPOs. So let's get started. If you prefer to follow along with the transcript, you can find this talk with speaker's note and alt text at bit.ly/OSPOlogy, the title of the session, -2022-business impact. And I'll make sure that that's posted again at the end of the slides. I'm sure somebody will post it in the chat in the next few seconds. So, hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Casares. I'm a white woman with light hair and eyes who usually wears glasses. I'm currently an open source scientist at Google's Open Source Programs Office, where I co-lead Google's research and engineering work with Project Ocean. We explore open source within ecosystems and a complex networks lens. This last year, in 2021, I was named external faculty at the Vermont Complex Systems Center. I serve an advisor for a few organizations, including Open Source Community Africa, as well as Vetsu Code, which is in the United States. I once co-authored a book. I call it a superb owl book because there's a nice owl on the cover with Alice Zhang on feature engineering. My most favorite step in machine learning pipelines, most frequently referred to these days as MAMA, and I'm a US Navy veteran. I'm sure everyone here has talked about what open source is at least once with somebody else. I do want to emphasize that we at Google support the standardized definition of open source that is maintained by the Open Source Initiative, which focuses on how software is distributed and licensed, as well as what you can and cannot do with software and still call it open source. And when we talk about open source at Google, we talk about more than license and distribution rules. This open concept continues to evolve to represent the frameworks that shape how software is created, released, shared, and distributed, as well as the communities themselves and how they form around projects. So when we talk about open source in this talk, please remember this is shorthand for this expanded framework, which includes software that is licensed with an approved open source license, as well as being developed using other open concepts. Now, this wider framework gives us space to consider open source as ecosystems and socio-technical systems, rather than just systems of compliance. So today, as we discuss open source and the kind of impact it has within your organization, we'll expand on the kinds of systems we focus on, as well as the tools we use to measure our impact on those systems. So as organizations with technical systems evolve, so must their supporting and adjacent teams. Your organization may be faced with challenges such as creating a common strategy for different licenses, which may impact your intellectual property plans, or making sure folks in your teams know who to ask questions to when they want to know what the rules are. And when these kinds of policies, strategies, and guidance are not centralized, it can be challenging for teams to ensure common practices across complex team structures. And so here's where we have found open source programs offices to be helpful. So, open source programs offices, commonly referred to as OSPOs, form to meet the needs of an organization and evolve as those needs change over time. So, if you are considering forming a new OSPO, I would highly encourage you to examine what your organization specifically needs rather than forking an existing team structure or strategy. And the rest of this talk will focus on the kind of work that our OSPO does, which may or may not be the work that you do in an OSPO. That's okay. I'm going to explain our framework for thinking about open source programs, and these do not need to sit within a centralized organization for that framework to apply. So at Google, our mission, the mission of Google Open Source, is bringing all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. And we do open many of our internal practices and playbooks at opensource.google. Now, this mission is big. The value of open source is a big concept with capital letters, and the resources of Google is also a big concept with capital letters. So now we have the question of, for all that we could be doing, what should we be doing? And so to separate out the should from the could, we really lean into the capital P in OSPO, which for us is programs. We spend a lot of time individually as leaders, as program managers, and as teams within a team, clarifying what we are working on and why. And so before you can outline stakeholders or critically consider the impact of your work, you and your team need to understand the why and the how of your OSPO. So we always want to be able to answer a few specific questions about every program in the Google open source portfolio. We want to know why we are doing this work, who are we doing it for, who are the stakeholders who care, and what our impact is on the business. So first, you need to know why you are doing this work. You may want to ask and document information like, can you explain why this program was created? What problems is its scope to focus on? Do the same problems exist today that existed when the program was first created? And where does your support come from? And once you know why you are doing this work, you'll need to know who this program is designed to serve. You'll want to examine questions like, who are you designing this for? And who are you intentionally leaving out in this design? So knowing who these programs for are is helpful, but these are also only one subset of the people who are interested in the outcomes of your program. Your organization may have a common definition of who a stakeholder is. If they do, you should absolutely use this, as it reduces context switching for people who you want to communicate with internally. If the organization you work with does not have a common way to define stakeholders, you have a few options. There are different philosophies on this. Just pick one that works best for your program. Clearly document your choice and why you chose that, and then you can move on to the next exercise. And once you know what a stakeholder looks like for your program, you can unpeel the onion of exactly who those stakeholders actually are. So you may want to consider defining these stakeholders not by name, but by aspects of their position, role, team, organization, or business partnerships with you. All of this work serves a dual purpose. By documenting the why of your work and who cares about it, you'll also be able to capture who you should be communicating with on a regular basis. This allows you all to define and clarify expectations, needs, shared outcomes, and potential future opportunities for collaboration. This is all essential work for being able to track and communicate the business impact of your open source programs. So we're actually about halfway through the talk. I want to make sure we leave lots of time for questions. But you'll notice frequently that I'm talking about impact and business impact, and I'm not talking about ROI. And this is extremely intentional. ROI is a very specific economic model, which we found to be too simplistic to capture the complexities of open source ecosystems. So, although sweeping generalizations and estimates can be made about first order costs on work like code reviews, such as what is the equivalent hourly pay times time invested in a review, this fails to account for the social and community investment made by the same code reviewer to work with a new committer to onboard them to a project, to help them track down bugs, and other sponsorship work which cannot be captured by that same metric. When we think about the business impact of programs, our recommendation is instead to consider the business impact of open source programs through an input output investment impact model. So to demonstrate this, we're examining investments as inputs to a larger system, and the impacts we can show from those as what comes out of it when we do things. We're understanding there are feedback loops and dynamics that are happening within these organizations that we may or may not be able to account for looking from the outside in. So, for this kind of model, we need to be looking at focusing on identifying your investments and contributions, all of them, right? So, in order for you to know what are you doing, you need to be able to actually clearly show the visible and invisible labor that is happening within your organization and external in the community, which supports all of these different kinds of investments. So we feel like clearly tracking these not only as monetary investments, but using other forms of identification will also help you show how much and where are you investing into different kinds of projects and communities. You want to know what kinds of stories you can show for your open source at your organization or organizations like yours. So if you are having a challenging time being able to show stories at your organization, you can look at organizations like yours to see what kind of storytelling they're using and see whether or not that's a model that you can adopt. You'll also want to understand how your stakeholders communicate. How do they measure the world? How do they identify success? And we're going to talk about that more. The reason for this is because tracking these more nuanced kind of investments and impact is not as simple as querying financial data. However, you can demonstrate this by defining useful program metrics and KPIs. So now we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the frameworks our OSPO teams use for metrics and KPIs, as well as a few use cases which show how these were put into practice. So first of all, I really want to ground us in the idea that metrics are measurements. Measurements are just recorded observations. So as we talk with teams and we work with them on the idea of quantifying any of the work or any of the work we're doing, we do see hesitation where people get a little bit nervous about simplifying their work down into these abstract concepts. So we like to try to just encourage them to think about we are just trying to observe things that are happening, recognizing that in and of themselves, we're not adding any judgment on those observations. We're just trying to pull information out so that we can talk about processes and programs more clearly. With this concept, also observations are not unbiased. So, what you choose to observe, the lens you use to observe it, what you choose to leave out, all of these decisions bias the outcomes regardless of your intention. So, you must record your design decisions and be clear as to your motives for observing and measuring as you're thinking about these metrics that you want to be able to use. Last, I just want to really ground us in the concept that when we're trying to do metrics and KPIs, really think of this as a scientific experiment. So when you have a hypothesis or when you have a question, what observations would you make to understand what is happening? And how can you collect data about those observations to really give you more insight into what's going on within your processes or your programs? And so in order to define useful metrics, we're not going to go into this fully. This is actually from a talk that the wonderful Julia Ferrioli and I gave at FOSS Backstage in 2021, where we dive much deeper into the idea of how do you create useful metrics for open source. And so our recommendation is really that we look at focusing on useful metrics. So in order to do that, you have to consider processes, outcomes, feedback loops, but you can really simplify this down into kind of a 5-step process. And so we start to encourage you to think about identifying your objectives, just like we talked about before. What is observable out of that? What is a baseline that you should be thinking about measuring against? Because it's always helpful to know what are you aiming for so you know what kind of observations you're going to be looking for scale. Defining your desired trend. Not everything needs to go up and to the right. So the best case metrics when we're looking at baselines, steady state is a nice place sometimes that you want to be in. Decreasing is when you want to get rid of things like either toxicity in a community or when you want to start to see toil go down. And then deserving, we think of the signal phenomena is this going to show up at the time of other metrics or does it come a little early or a little late? So that if you see something pop up in a gathered dashboard, is it giving you a signal of something larger to come? And you can see more about this at this link here, bit.ly/FOSS-backstage.pram. Okay, so one use case we want to be able to talk about is when we're looking at like developing and iterating on useful metrics. So we've done a lot of work to go through and understand how can we start to quantify contributions to open source. And so starting in, it was actually in 2020, Sophia Vargas, another researcher on the OSPO team, started a annual analysis looking at measuring Alphabet's contributions to open source. And Sophia dives into information like our data that's available on GitHub or internal Git resources, pulls together program information, and is really trying to create this collective picture of explaining how have our contributions changed and what can we show for the last year of our work in open source programs. If you go see kind of the work from 2020 and how it's moved in 2021, so the 2019, 2020, and then now in progress is the 2021 summary. But the interesting thing, I feel like bringing this up here is because the annual analysis is really centering on this mission that we have of resources of Google for open source. So it's not just to be able to show, here's things that we did, here's all of the ways that we can say we contributed in general. It's really focused on finding information and data and analysis that explains what resources of Google are we dedicating towards open source and why. We explicitly outline the data samples, the evolving methodology that we're using because it is changing over time, not just because of data sources, but also because of how we learn, how we talk about contributions, and how we talk about expanded contributions beyond the OSPO team. It's a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methods, and we'll be adding in a few more interesting things this year. I'm really excited about it. Sophia and I are working together, and I advise you to keep a lookout for it. Hopefully it'll be released sooner than, I think the date on this is August. It's always interesting trying to release internal information out into the world. We're hoping this year to be releasing it much sooner than August. So getting back to this idea of useful metrics, KPIs, key performance indicators, are a very specific kind of metric. So they measure pulse points that correlate to a process, program, or product being considered successful. So that sounds great. In order to be able to define KPIs, you do need to define what success is or looks like, both for you and all of your stakeholders, in order to make them most useful. And the reason for this is because what defines success for you may be different than what defines success for your stakeholders. So as you are focused on all of the great things that you are very excited about, that may not mesh with your stakeholders' interests. And when you try to explain the success of your programs to them using your own language and your goals, you may not be reaching them at a place where they fully understand the impact of your work on their organization or on their goals. So, walking through and being able to define success for yourself includes things like, how do you introduce people to your work? Have you written a mission statement? How do you talk about your team to other people in your organization? How do other people introduce your team's work? So, all of this goes to creating a general sense of being able to point back to something when you're explaining to people why you were doing things and what does success eventually look like as a part of that program, project, or product. And so This is a very different question than how do you define success for your stakeholders? So you want to have both of these works and documentation as a part of your program work. So for each stakeholder, we're encouraging to, and the work that we do is really starting to map out what are the additional pieces that help us identify metrics we should be tracking to show success of our programs to our stakeholders, which may be different than success for us. And you can find information about what your stakeholders envision success to look like based on their, again, same kind of key things. What are their missions? What are their visions? Their business goals? Do they have a shared roadmap that you can point to and be able to pull information out on? Do you have shared dashboards that you can work off of? But all of this is to get together as to when you're looking at defining signals to be able to show success, what are those signals that you can explore for KPIs that you can track in order to show success externally to your team for your stakeholders? And I do want to put in the note here as you're defining your KPIs and your metrics, how often and when to measure those does not depend on when someone wants a report. It depends on how quickly things are changing with those signals. So if you continuously report on a signal in a system that is not changing very frequently over time, you may not be giving as useful information as to maybe adjusting when you are doing reporting as opposed to when you are doing measuring. And this links back to ideas in systems theory and signals theory, as well as electrical engineering, matters just as much here in analytics and reporting out. And so additional considerations for how and when to measure KPIs can include things like aggregation buckets, how you're going to group or compare things together. Collection cycles, again, when do you want to be observing things and how often so that you're clearly communicating when people can expect change to happen. Reporting cycles, as we talked about for the contributions blog, like when do you want to make public your observation? And also privacy and security risks. So you're going to, especially working in open source, just because we are a transparent community or organization does not necessarily mean that there are not privacy or security risks linked with people's information and sharing that more widely. So the final use case I'd like to talk about is defining KPIs for open source events. So myself, Cassandra Dillon, Teresa Terasaki, and Maria Cruz, three excellent program managers as a part of our team, all work on events for open source programs in three different capacities. And so initially the ask was that we get together and try to talk about what common metrics should they be using. And the more that we talked, the more that we realized that the missions of each of these programs, although may have some commonalities, are actually three completely separate missions. So we went through the whole process both together to find where there were shared joint metrics they could be using, but also where we could document when even saying something as simple as an audience or an expected audience or a potential audience was different depending on the kind of event you were holding. So we're able to go through and identify overlapping stakeholders and success metrics, clearly define when you cannot use the same metric going across programs or even across events, and also clarifying individual program missions to be able to define program-specific KPIs. So we went through and iterated on each of the missions and really kind of clearly pulled out each phrase and asked, like, well, what do you really mean by this? How would you expect to see that? If you were talking about that, what kind of information would you want to use to be able to discuss whether or not this is something you need to take action on? And so we went from KPIs to metrics, working together on kind of some defined metrics for reporting. And it was a really lovely exercise also that helped the program team to increase communication with each other, to learn more about the kinds of programs they were working on and to see if there were any shared opportunities for workflows. So we can look to see if we can also increase some efficiency amongst the programs. I just want to really kind of land on the idea that we are all on this open source raft together. This can be a very challenging space to work in when you are either feeling by yourself, as some folks are in their OSPOs or in their open source role. And I want to encourage you to remember that we are all here for each other. At least I am. This is why I come here, is for community. So when we talk about open source, we continuously focus on more than the code or the specific license because the community means so much and is so helpful. Managing open source in organizations requires very good program management practice. For some folks, it can be very attractive to just focus on code or licenses, but in doing so, I think that you're not able to account for all of the other factors that will influence and affect your organization. I encourage you to avoid ROI to show the value of your investments through looking at impact and looking at how much your investments are putting in, making those visible. And also the idea that metrics and KPIs are a reflection of what matters to you. So please focus on ones that are useful to you. And with that, I will say Thank you, and pause to open up for questions.